Chapter 1. The Child of Mecca. The sands of Mecca were still and quiet that night, a warm breeze drifting through the streets of the sacred city. But within one home, the air was tense, filled with anticipation and whispers. The Banu Makhzum tribe was powerful, respected, and feared. They had wealth, warriors, and a lineage that connected them to the ancient nobility of Mecca. And now? Now they had a new son, born into their proud line. This child, Khalid ibn al-Walid, arrived into a world of power, rivalry, and ancient customs. "Look at him," someone whispered, standing over the newborn, "a child of strength." Already there was a sense, a strange, quiet certainty that this child was different. Strong hands, a piercing gaze. Khalid's family couldn't shake the feeling that he was born for something extraordinary. As Khalid grew, the expectations around him were heavy, and they were high. In Mecca, life was strict, rules were firm, and family honor meant everything. Khalid learned to walk with pride, to speak with confidence. Every day, he absorbed the stories of his people, the tales of courage, loyalty, and fierce battles. He heard the legends of the Banu Makhzum, and he knew he had to be ready to add to them. The elders would gather, often with him nearby, speaking of the ancient ways, discussing power, wealth, and control. These were serious men, hard-faced, their voices low and deliberate. Khalid learned early to stay silent, to watch, to listen, and he noticed everything. He noticed the flickers of fear and anger in their eyes when they spoke of certain matters, the tightness in their jaws when they mentioned rival tribes, or the emerging new faith spreading quietly through the city. For a child, Khalid had a remarkable sense of things left unsaid. He could feel the tension in the air as he wandered Mecca's narrow streets, a feeling of secrecy that lingered like a shadow. Even as a young boy, Khalid showed a rare boldness. When he was still just a child, perhaps 10 years old, he witnessed something that would mark him forever. A group of boys gathered in the marketplace, taunting and throwing stones at a smaller boy from a weaker tribe. Khalid watched, silent, intense, until something inside him snapped. Without a word, he stepped forward, his voice ringing out like a clap of thunder. "Stop!" he commanded, his voice unshaken, his gaze cold. The boys stopped, glancing at him in shock. Even at that young age, Khalid had a presence that made others take notice. With firm steps, he walked toward the smaller boy and pulled him to his feet, his hand strong and steady. "You don't need to fight to be strong," he told him, his voice soft but sure. "But if someone fights you, remember, don't ever let them see your fear." From that moment, whispers began to circulate in Mecca about Khalid, the child who held himself like a warrior, the boy who understood courage before he was old enough to know fear. Khalid's courage was not limited to his heart alone. His body, too, was trained to be strong. His father, Walid, saw to that. Walid, a fierce and seasoned warrior, took pride in his son's strength and resilience. He trained Khalid himself, teaching him the ways of combat, the art of strategy, and the ability to endure pain. Khalid learned to wrestle, to throw, to strike with precision, but there was more. Walid taught him the importance of respect and honor, the need to stand tall even in the face of defeat. For hours, they would train under the blazing sun, sweat pouring down Khalid's face as he gritted his teeth, refusing to give in. And each time he stumbled or fell, Walid would be there, his voice stern but encouraging. "Get up, Khalid. Strength is in getting back up." And he would rise, again and again, each fall making him stronger, each mistake sharpening his focus. With every lesson, Khalid's resolve grew, his ambition deepening. He began to understand the weight of his lineage, the importance of his role in the Banu Makhzum, and what it meant to be a leader, a protector, a warrior. Yet life in Mecca was not without its shadows. Despite his noble blood, Khalid saw cruelty around him, felt the pulse of fear that ran beneath the city's surface. There were whispers of a new faith rising, a strange belief that spoke of equality, kindness, and mercy. To some, it was a threat. To others, it was a promise. Khalid's family despised it. They spoke against it fiercely, warning him and his brothers to stay away. His father's voice was harsh whenever he spoke of it, filled with anger and a hint of fear. "These people," he would say, "they're challenging everything we know. Honor, family. They're tearing it apart with their talk of unity. Stay clear of them." But Khalid was curious. He didn't understand this fear, this bitterness. Why did his family feel so threatened? Why did they view kindness as weakness? In his heart, he felt a stirring of questions he could not voice, a desire to understand what lay behind the hostility. As he grew older, Khalid's curiosity only deepened, and with it, his strength. His reputation in Mecca began to spread. He became known not just as the son of Walid, but as a young man of honor, of justice. He was often seen standing alone in the marketplace, watching, always watching, as if he could see the invisible threads of tension running through his city. The people began to talk. "He's more than his father's son," they would say. "This boy has something different, something fierce, something pure." And in the evenings, when the stars glittered over Mecca and the fires burned low, Khalid would sit alone, thinking of the future. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the strange certainty that he was meant for something beyond what he could yet understand. He sensed a challenge on the horizon, something that would test his strength, his courage, his heart. Years passed, and Khalid grew into a young man, tall, strong, his face hard as stone, his eyes sharp as steel. He had become everything his family hoped for, a figure of respect and power. But deep inside, there was something more, something restless and unsatisfied. He wanted to prove himself, to find a purpose beyond wealth, beyond family pride. The city of Mecca had begun to feel too small for Khalid, its ancient walls pressing in around him, its traditions growing heavy. He longed for something beyond, a chance to fight for something greater than himself. He could sense the winds of change stirring, like the whisper of a storm on the horizon. He was ready, ready for whatever fate held for him, and he could feel in his very bones that it would be glorious, that it would be fierce, that it would be the making of him. And thus, the child of Mecca awaited his destiny. Chapter 2. The Path to Justice. The sun was setting over Mecca, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow streets. As the last light of day began to fade, Khalid ibn al-Walid, a young man yet wise beyond his years, walked the dusty paths, eyes sharp, senses alert. He knew his place in this city, knew that people watched him, respected him, and feared him. Khalid's heart beat with a strong sense of justice. He was a warrior, yes, but he was more than that. He was a protector. He saw the pain and struggles of others, felt the unfairness that ran through Mecca's streets like a silent undercurrent. In a world shaped by loyalty to one's tribe above all else, Khalid dared to question, dared to believe in something higher than tradition. One evening, as he walked through the bustling market, a scene caught his eye. A merchant, a proud, wealthy man with a look of disdain on his face, was arguing with a small boy. The boy's clothes were tattered, his eyes wide with fear. The merchant accused him of stealing, his voice echoing through the market. "You thief!" the merchant spat, his face twisted with anger. "How dare you steal from me?" The boy shook his head, his small frame trembling. "I didn't, sir. I swear, I didn't take anything." But the merchant was relentless. He grabbed the boy's arm, his grip tight and merciless. "Lies! You deserve punishment, boy." In that moment, Khalid felt a surge of anger, a fire burning in his chest. He could see the terror in the boy's eyes, the desperation. Without a second thought, Khalid stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Let him go," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The merchant looked at Khalid, his eyes widening in surprise, but he did not release the boy. Instead, he sneered, "This is none of your business, Khalid. The boy is a thief." Khalid's gaze hardened, his eyes cold as steel. "And I say, let him go. Unless you have proof, your accusations mean nothing." The marketplace fell silent. People turned, watching with bated breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Khalid's presence was like a storm, calm on the surface, but filled with power and control. The merchant faltered, his grip loosening as he felt the weight of Khalid's gaze. Finally, he released the boy, who stumbled back, rubbing his arm, his eyes still wide with shock. Khalid knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Go," he said softly, his voice gentle but strong. "You're safe now." The boy nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes as he disappeared into the crowd. And as Khalid rose, the people around him murmured with respect, nodding to each other. Once again, Khalid had shown them that honor was not about wealth or power, it was about justice. But Khalid's sense of justice did not always make life easy. In a world ruled by tribes, where bloodlines determined loyalty, Khalid often found himself standing alone. Many of his family members, powerful men with hardened hearts, questioned his choices. One night, as the stars glittered over Mecca, Khalid's father, Walid, confronted him. They stood outside, beneath the desert sky, a tension filling the air like the calm before a storm. "Khalid," Walid began, his voice low, "I have heard of your actions in the marketplace. People say you defend strangers, outsiders. They say you speak of justice for all." His tone was filled with a hint of anger, mixed with confusion. "But you are a son of the Banu Makhzum. Your loyalty is to our people, our tribe." Khalid met his father's gaze, his expression steady, unyielding. "Father," he replied, his voice calm, "loyalty is important, yes, but justice is greater. If I see wrong, I cannot look away, even if it is inconvenient, even if it is against our own." Walid's face hardened, his hands clenching into fists. "Your honor is to your family, Khalid, to your people. Remember that." His voice was cold, a warning hanging in the air. But Khalid simply nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I do honor our family, Father, but I will honor justice first, always." As the years passed, Khalid's reputation grew. People in Mecca spoke of him in hushed voices, respecting his courage, his fairness, and his willingness to stand against the powerful, even if it meant standing alone. Khalid had become more than just a young warrior. He was a symbol, a beacon of strength and justice in a city where such qualities were often hidden in the shadows. One evening, a woman from a weaker tribe came to him, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling with fear. Her son had been wronged, humiliated by men from a stronger tribe, and no one dared to help. She had heard of Khalid's bravery, his kindness. She knelt before him, begging for justice. Khalid lifted her to her feet, his expression serious, filled with empathy. "Do not kneel to me," he said softly, "for justice is your right." He promised her that he would see her son protected, that those who had wronged him would answer for their actions. And true to his word, Khalid confronted the men who had shamed the boy, his presence unyielding, his words like stone. He made it clear that he would not tolerate cruelty, that no tribe, no matter how powerful, could act without consequence. And once more, the people saw the strength of his character, the fierceness of his heart. Khalid's dedication to justice began to change him, shaping him into a man of rare honor. Yet it also brought danger as the tensions in Mecca grew. The city was divided, old loyalties clashing with new ideas. Whispers spread of the Prophet Muhammad and his teachings, of the growing faith that spoke of mercy and equality. And although Khalid had yet to accept this new faith, he found himself drawn to its ideals, to its message of compassion and fairness. In secret, he would listen to the stories, to the tales of kindness and forgiveness. And in his heart, he began to wonder, what if justice could be more than a battle, more than a struggle? What if it could be a way of life? But he kept these thoughts hidden, for the time was not yet right, and he knew that his family, his tribe, would not understand. Khalid walked a fine line, balancing his duty to his people with his own unshakable sense of right and wrong. One evening, as the winds of change swept through Mecca, Khalid stood alone, staring out over the desert. He felt the weight of his choices, the burden of his sense of justice. He knew that his path was difficult, that each step brought him closer to conflict, closer to a destiny he could not yet see. But he did not falter. In his heart, he knew he would fight for what was right, that he would protect those who needed him, no matter the cost. For Khalid ibn al-Walid, honor was not just a word, it was a promise. And with that promise, he set forth on the path of justice. Chapter 3. A Heart Divided. Faith and Family. The Prophet Muhammad's message spread slowly at first, a whisper in the air, a gentle call. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, reaching even the mightiest families of Mecca, families like Khalid's. The Banu Makhzum tribe had power, wealth, and a legacy rooted deeply in tradition. To them, this new message, this talk of a single God, of equality, of mercy, was a threat, a challenge to everything they knew, everything they held dear. But to Khalid, the message was different. He didn't understand it, not completely. Yet he felt a strange pull in his heart, a curiosity he couldn't ignore. He had seen the Muslims, their resilience, the way they stood firm, even under attack. And though he knew his family despised them, he couldn't deny a growing respect within him for their courage. One night, as the stars glittered above Mecca like 1,000 silent witnesses, Khalid lay awake, wrestling with thoughts he couldn't share. His mind was filled with questions, his heart heavy with doubt. He knew where his loyalty should lie. His family, his tribe, they demanded nothing less. Yet, something in him resisted. In the quiet darkness, he thought back to the marketplace, to the times he had stood up for justice, even when it meant going against his people. This felt similar. The Muslims spoke of a world where the strong did not crush the weak, where kindness was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Could there be truth in this message? Or was he being led astray, deceived by a dangerous idea? He didn't know. And the not knowing, it haunted him. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in Mecca grew. The powerful tribes, including the Banu Makhzum, began to take notice, their displeasure turning into anger, then hatred. They spoke out fiercely, warning their sons, their daughters, their families to avoid this new faith. "It's poison," they would say, their voices filled with fear. "It will tear apart our families, our city, our very way of life." Khalid felt the weight of their words, but he also felt something deeper, a pang of doubt. He could see the courage in the eyes of those who followed the Prophet Muhammad. He could see their quiet strength, their unyielding resolve. The more he saw, the harder it became to ignore the quiet voice inside him, the voice that questioned and questioned. One day, as Khalid trained with his younger brother, Walid, in the courtyard of their home, he noticed the worry in his brother's eyes. Walid, who had always looked up to him, seemed different, hesitant. Khalid put down his sword, looking at his brother with concern. "Walid," he asked, "what troubles you?" Walid glanced around, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have heard things, disturbing things." He took a shaky breath. "They say some of our own people are thinking of joining the Muslims, following Muhammad." The words hung heavy in the air, and Khalid felt his heart skip a beat. His family? His tribe? Could it be true? His mind raced, trying to understand. Yet, a strange feeling, one he dared not name, stirred within him. But he kept his face calm, his voice steady. "They are fools if they think they can go against the tribe." Inside, however, Khalid's thoughts churned. He couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was happening, something bigger than the Banu Makhzum, bigger than Mecca itself. He felt caught between two worlds, two choices, each pulling at his heart with relentless force. As the conflict grew, Khalid saw more and more of his family's hatred for the Muslims. They spoke of the followers of Muhammad as traitors, threats to their traditions, to their honor. His uncles, his cousins, even his own father, each spoke with fire in their voices, condemning the new faith. One evening, at a family gathering, Khalid listened as his uncle, a fierce warrior himself, spoke with venomous rage. "These people, they're a danger to all we have built. They speak of tearing down our gods, of abandoning our ancestors. They threaten the very spirit of Mecca." Everyone nodded in agreement, their faces hard with anger. Khalid forced himself to remain silent, though his heart beat faster, a storm of emotions swirling within him. His family's fear, their anger, it felt almost desperate, as though they knew they could not stop this growing movement. When the gathering ended, Khalid stayed behind, his gaze lingering on the dim glow of the fire, his mind lost in thought. How could something so feared, so hated, feel so compelling? His chest tightened with the weight of the question, a question he could not share, even with himself. And then the nightmares began. Khalid found himself waking in the dead of night, his body drenched in sweat, his heart racing, dreams of battles, of flames, of an unseen force calling to him. The dreams left him shaken, a fear he could not name gripping his heart. In his waking hours, he tried to push them away, to focus on his training, his duty. But the dreams returned, night after night, haunting him. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Khalid went to his father, hoping to find peace, to ease his troubled mind. But Walid's response only deepened his confusion. "Khalid," his father said, his voice steady but stern, "do not be swayed by whispers and shadows. Remember who you are. Remember your place. You are a son of the Banu Makhzum, and your loyalty lies with us, with our gods, our people." The words, meant to comfort, felt hollow. Khalid nodded, hiding his doubts, but the questions would not leave him. How could he ignore what he had seen? The strength, the dignity, the resilience of the Muslims. How could he deny the admiration he felt, even as his family spoke against them? One day, as Khalid walked the edge of the city, he came upon a small group of Muslims gathered in prayer. He stayed hidden, watching from a distance, his heart pounding. There, kneeling in the sand, their voices low but filled with conviction, he saw something that stirred his very soul. There was no anger, no hatred, only peace. In that moment, Khalid felt a longing he could not name, a yearning for a sense of peace he had never known. But almost as quickly as it came, the feeling was buried beneath the weight of duty, of loyalty, of fear. He was Khalid ibn al-Walid, a son of the Banu Makhzum. His loyalty belonged to his family. And yet, as he turned to leave, he felt an ache, a pang deep within him. He knew he could not stay silent forever. He was a warrior, trained to face his enemies without fear. But now, his greatest battle was within himself. The sun was setting over Mecca once again, the sky painted in hues of crimson and gold, as Khalid stood alone, watching the fading light. His heart was heavy, divided, torn between two paths, the path of loyalty, of tradition, of family, and the path of justice, of truth, of something he could not yet understand. He took a deep breath, his mind racing, his soul torn. He knew that the path he chose would define him, would shape his future. But for now, he was still searching, still questioning, still caught between faith and family. And so, Khalid ibn al-Walid stood, a heart divided, awaiting the day when he would choose his destiny. Chapter 4. The Battle of Uhud, Khalid's strategic genius unleashed. The dawn of the battlefield was thick with dust and tension. The sun had barely risen, yet its fierce light cast an eerie glow over the valley of Uhud. Khalid ibn al-Walid, his heart steady, his mind razor-sharp, felt the weight of the moment. He stood with his cavalry, their horses restless, sensing the excitement and the fear that hung in the air. Before them, across the field, stood the Muslim forces, led by none other than the Prophet Muhammad himself. Khalid's pulse quickened. He knew the stakes, knew that this battle was more than a clash of swords. It was a clash of beliefs, of wills, and he, Khalid, would show his people, his enemies, and even himself what he was capable of. The battle began with a thunderous roar as men surged forward, their cries filling the air. Swords met swords, shields clanged, and the dust rose around them like a shroud. Khalid watched, His eyes narrowed, calculating every movement, every decision. This was where he excelled, where his true genius shone. Amidst the chaos, he found order. He observed the lines, the formations, searching for any sign of weakness. And then he saw it. A small hill on the side of the battlefield, guarded by Muslim archers. From that hill, they could see everything, controlling the field. It was a perfect position, a place of strength. But Khalid noticed something else. The archers seemed distracted, their focus wavering. He knew instantly what he had to do. With a single command, he rallied his men, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Stay close, follow my lead, wait for the moment." The men around him looked at him with awe, their fear replaced by trust. They knew that Khalid was more than a warrior. He was a strategist, a mind always 3 steps ahead. They trusted him with their lives, their honor, knowing that he could see things others missed. The fighting intensified, and Khalid's eyes remained locked on that hill, watching, waiting. And then he saw his chance. The Muslim archers were moving, distracted by the victory they thought was theirs. They were leaving their posts, abandoning the high ground. "Now!" he shouted, urging his horse forward, his men following close behind. Like a silent storm, they moved up the hill, swift and unseen. His heart pounded with the thrill of the moment, the rush of seizing an opportunity. This was his gift, seeing the weakness, striking at the perfect moment. As they reached the top, the remaining archers, caught by surprise, barely had time to react. Khalid's cavalry overwhelmed them with ease, driving them back. His heart raced with triumph as he gazed over the battlefield below. From here, he could see the entire field, see the Muslim forces caught off guard, confused. He raised his sword high, his voice ringing out, "Attack!" His men surged forward, charging down the hill with fierce cries, crashing into the unprepared Muslim ranks. The battlefield erupted into chaos, the Muslim forces reeling from the surprise attack. Khalid's charge split their lines, creating confusion and panic. He could feel the tide of victory turning, could sense the fear in his enemies' eyes as they scrambled to regroup. For Khalid, this was more than a victory. It was a test of his skill, his mind. He maneuvered his men with precision, each move calculated, each strike intentional. His mind was like steel, unbending, focused. He felt alive, more alive than he had ever felt before, as he directed his forces with flawless execution. But even as he reveled in his success, there was a strange feeling growing within him. A shadow, something that lingered at the edge of his mind. The sight of the Muslim forces fighting with such resilience, such unbreakable spirit. It stirred something in him, a question he did not want to answer. As the battle neared its end, Khalid stood amidst the dust and blood, his heart pounding with the thrill of triumph. The Muslim forces were retreating, their lines broken, their hope dimmed. Khalid felt the rush of victory, the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. Yet, as he watched the defeated army, he could not shake a strange, unsettling feeling. Despite the chaos, despite the loss, he saw something in them that left him questioning. The Muslims, though beaten, did not look broken. Their eyes held a light, a fierce resolve, something beyond mere survival. Khalid turned away, dismissing the thought. He was a warrior of the Quraysh, a son of Mecca, loyal to his people, his tribe. And yet, as he rode through the aftermath, he found himself haunted by the memory of those eyes, by the courage they held even in defeat. As he led his men back to Mecca, Khalid's thoughts were heavy, his heart divided. The victory was his, yet it did not feel complete. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, a question he could not silence. Why did the Muslims fight with such determination, such faith? What was it that drove them, that made them unafraid even in the face of death? He pushed the thought aside, determined to ignore it, to forget. But it lingered, like an echo in the back of his mind. Khalid had always believed that strength, that strategy and power were everything. Yet today, he had seen a strength of a different kind, a strength that did not yield, even in loss. In the quiet of his tent that night, Khalid sat alone, the sounds of celebration fading around him. His men, his fellow warriors, they were all rejoicing, singing of their victory, toasting their triumph. But Khalid, he felt no joy, only a strange, hollow feeling that gnawed at him. He thought of the Prophet Muhammad, the leader of the Muslims. He thought of the stories he had heard, of mercy, of justice, of equality, stories he had dismissed, ridiculed even. But now, having faced those followers in battle, he could no longer dismiss them so easily. What drives them? He whispered to himself, the question hanging in the air, unanswered. He clenched his fists, frustrated with himself, with his own doubts. He was Khalid ibn al-Walid, a warrior, a leader. He had no time for questions, no space for weakness, and yet the questions remained, refusing to leave him in peace. The Battle of Uhud had shown him the power of his own mind, the strength of his own resolve, but it had also shown him something he was not ready to face, a glimpse of something greater than himself, a spark that both intrigued and unsettled him. As he lay down to rest, his thoughts drifted, his mind restless. He had won the battle, but a new battle was brewing within him, one that would not be fought with swords or strategy, one that would test the depths of his soul. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the fierce warrior, the brilliant strategist, was beginning to question his own path. And though he did not yet know it, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change him forever. The sands of fate were shifting, and Khalid's heart was caught in the storm. Chapter 5. Embracing Islam, the warrior's choice. The night was deep and silent, a heavy cloak of darkness covering the sands of the desert, and Khalid ibn al-Walid, the warrior, the strategist, lay awake, his heart pounding, his mind a storm. He had tried to silence his thoughts, tried to bury his questions, his doubts, but tonight, something within him had changed. For weeks now, the words, the teachings of Islam had haunted him. He remembered the courage he had seen in the Muslims at Uhud, their faith unbroken even in defeat. He had felt it again and again, a pull, a force stronger than any army, urging him to listen, to understand. And though he fought against it, the urge to know the truth had grown until it could no longer be ignored. At last, he sat up, his heart racing, a decision made. I can't live with this shadow any longer. I must know. Khalid rose, wrapped himself in his cloak, and stepped outside, the cold desert air biting at his face. Every step felt heavy, filled with tension, a sense of finality. He knew what this choice meant. He knew the risks, the dangers. If his family, his tribe, discovered his intentions, they would see it as betrayal. They would see him as a traitor, an outcast. The Banu Makhzum would turn against him, perhaps even hunt him down. But Khalid's heart was set. He had fought battles on the field, faced enemies without fear, but this This was the greatest battle of his life. And for the first time, he would fight for something greater than pride or power. He would fight for truth. He traveled in secret, the journey long and silent, his thoughts his only company. Every mile he covered brought him closer to a new world, a world he had once rejected, even ridiculed. He thought of his past, of his days as a warrior against the Muslims, his pride in each victory. How strange, he thought, that life would bring him here, that the very people he had fought might now be the ones he would stand beside. At last, he arrived at the outskirts of the Muslim camp, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Khalid, the sword of the Quraysh, the man known for his strength, felt vulnerable, exposed. What would they think? Would they accept him or turn him away, remembering only his past? He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and walked forward. As he approached, the guards recognized him, their eyes widening in shock. They whispered among themselves, their voices filled with disbelief. Could it be Khalid ibn al-Walid? He saw the fear, the suspicion in their eyes. They knew him as an enemy, a fierce and cunning warrior. But Khalid's gaze was calm, his heart unwavering. "I am here to see the Prophet," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I come in peace." One of the guards hesitated, his eyes scanning Khalid's face for any sign of deception, but there was none. After a tense moment, the guard nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. As Khalid entered the camp, he felt the eyes of the Muslims upon him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. And then he saw him. The Prophet Muhammad stood before him, his face calm, his gaze steady. There was no anger, no resentment, only a quiet strength that radiated from him. In that moment, Khalid felt something break within him, a wall, a barrier he had carried for so long. He realized that he had not come here to meet a leader. He had come to meet a truth. Khalid approached, his steps slow, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a strange weight in his throat, an emotion he could not name. Finally, he stopped, lowering his gaze, unable to meet the Prophet's eyes. "My heart has led me here," he whispered, his voice filled with humility. "I have seen the courage of your people. I have felt the strength of your words. I come to embrace Islam." The words hung in the air, a confession, a release. He felt the weight of his past, his battles, his pride, all fall away, replaced by a feeling he had never known, peace. The Prophet Muhammad stepped forward, his eyes warm, his smile gentle. "Welcome, Khalid," he said, his voice soft but powerful. "Islam does not seek vengeance, nor does it remember grudges. Your past does not define your future." Khalid looked up, his heart filled with a gratitude he could not express. He had feared rejection, feared judgment, but here he found only acceptance, kindness. In that moment, he felt something within him shift, as though his very soul had been set free. With a deep breath, he knelt down, bowing not only his head, but his heart, surrendering himself to the path he had chosen. And so Khalid, the fierce warrior of Mecca, became a follower of Islam. He knew the path would be difficult, knew that his family, his tribe, would not understand. But he no longer feared their judgment, for he had found a truth greater than their approval. As he rose, a new determination filled him, a determination not only to follow this path but to protect it, to defend it with the same strength, the same courage he had once used against it. For Khalid, this was not just a new belief. It was a new purpose. Over the following days, Khalid learned from the Prophet Muhammad, absorbing each word, each lesson with a hunger, a thirst for understanding. He saw the kindness in the Prophet's actions, the compassion in his teachings. He witnessed the unity, the brotherhood that Islam inspired, and he felt himself change bit by bit. Gone was the man who fought only for pride, for glory. In his place stood a man who fought for justice, for faith. Khalid had always been a warrior, but now he was a warrior with purpose. He knew that there would be battles ahead, struggles he could not yet imagine. But he also knew that he would face them without fear, for he was no longer alone. He was part of something greater, something eternal. One evening, as he sat by the fire with his new brothers, Khalid felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he had never known. The stars sparkled above, silent witnesses to his transformation, to his choice. He turned to one of his companions, a man who had once fought against him, a man who now welcomed him as a brother. "Tell me," Khalid asked, his voice soft, "what does it mean to be a true believer?" The man smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "It means to have faith in Allah, to trust His guidance, to seek truth above all else. It means to fight not for yourself, but for others, to protect, to serve." Khalid nodded, the words settling deep within him. This was what he had been searching for. This was the path he was meant to walk. And so, with a heart renewed, Khalid ibn al-Walid embraced Islam fully, accepting not only its beliefs, but its purpose. He knew his journey had just begun, knew there would be trials, tests of his resolve. But he felt no fear. For the first time, he understood his place in the world, his role in something greater than himself. As the fire flickered, casting shadows over the desert sands, Khalid looked up at the sky, a silent vow forming in his heart. "I will fight," he whispered, his voice strong. "I will defend this path with all that I am." Khalid, the sword of Allah, had been born anew. Chapter 6. The Sword of Allah. The desert winds whispered through the camp, carrying with them a sense of fate, of a destiny fulfilled. Khalid ibn al-Walid, once a fierce enemy of Islam, now stood among the Prophet Muhammad's closest companions. But he was more than just a soldier, more than just another follower. He was about to be given a title that would echo through history, a title that would carry the weight of a lifetime, the weight of a warrior's soul. The Prophet had seen Khalid's strength, his loyalty, and his courage. He had witnessed his transformation from a fierce enemy to a devoted protector, and on that fateful day, he called Khalid to him. Standing before the Prophet, Khalid felt a mix of awe and humility. He waited, his heart racing, knowing that this moment would define him, that from this day on, his life would never be the same. The Prophet's words were soft, yet they held a power that sent shivers down Khalid's spine. "Khalid," he said, his voice filled with purpose, "from this day forth, you shall be known as Saifullah, the sword of Allah." Khalid's breath caught, his heart pounding with both pride and a deep sense of responsibility. The sword of Allah. It was more than a title. It was a trust, a mission, a vow that would demand everything he had. This was not just a role. It was his life. As word of his new title spread, Khalid could feel the weight of eyes upon him, some filled with respect, others with awe. He knew that with this title came expectations. He was no longer just Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was Saifullah, and he would wield his sword not for himself, not for pride or glory, but for his faith. That night, Khalid sat alone, the stars above him silent witnesses to his thoughts. He felt the weight of his sword by his side, its cold steel a reminder of the life he had chosen. He understood that he was now a symbol, a shield, a weapon, a guardian of Islam. He thought of the battles to come, the lives he would defend, the sacrifices he would make. In the quiet of the night, he whispered to himself, his voice steady and calm, "I am the sword of Allah, and I will not falter." But the path of the sword was not an easy one. The days that followed were filled with preparation, strategy, and training. Khalid's mind, always sharp, became sharper still, and his heart grew fierce with purpose. His loyalty to Islam was unbreakable, his commitment unwavering. He understood that as Saifullah, he was expected to lead with both strength and wisdom, to make decisions not just for victory, but for justice. One of the first tests of his new title came soon after. Word had arrived of a powerful enemy force, marching with the intention of crushing the Muslims. The news sent ripples of fear through the camp, but Khalid's eyes were steady, his resolve like iron. He stood before his men, his voice strong, his presence commanding. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying across the camp, "they may come with numbers, they may come with power, but we have something greater. We have purpose. We have faith." His words lit a fire within them, and they looked upon him with a loyalty that only a true leader could inspire. Khalid, the sword of Allah, had given them courage. He had given them a reason to stand firm, to fight with everything they had. The battle that followed was fierce, a clash of steel and strength that echoed across the sands. Khalid moved like a shadow through the chaos, his sword flashing, his mind sharp, calculating every move. He led his men with precision, his voice ringing out with commands that brought order to the storm of battle. At one point, he saw a line of enemy soldiers breaking through. He knew that if they succeeded, his men would be surrounded. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, charging toward the line, his sword raised high. His heart pounded, but he felt no fear, only a fierce determination to protect, to defend. With a cry that echoed across the field, Khalid struck, his sword moving with deadly accuracy. The enemy fell back, stunned by his ferocity, and his men surged forward, inspired by his courage. In that moment, Khalid was not just a warrior. He was a force, an unbreakable shield for his people. When the battle ended, victory was theirs. Khalid stood among his men, his body weary but his spirit unyielding. His gaze swept over the battlefield, his heart filled with both pride and a solemn understanding. Each victory, he knew, was a gift, a trust placed in him by Allah, and he would honor that trust, no matter the cost. The men around him looked to him with admiration, their eyes filled with respect. To them, he was more than just their leader. He was their symbol of strength, their reminder of what they were fighting for. They saw in him the embodiment of faith, of loyalty, of courage. They saw in him the sword of Allah. As they returned to camp, Khalid noticed a young soldier, his face etched with fear, his hands trembling. Khalid approached him, his voice soft but firm. "Fear not," he said, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "We fight with purpose. We fight with faith. Remember that, and you will never be alone." The young soldier looked up, his eyes shining with gratitude. In that moment, Khalid realized the true weight of his title, not just as a warrior, but as a guide, a mentor, a protector for those who looked to him for strength. In the weeks that followed, Khalid's reputation as the Sword of Allah grew. His loyalty was unbreakable, his bravery unmatched. But with each victory, he felt a deeper responsibility. He knew that he could not afford to be careless, to act on impulse. Each decision he made, each life he took, had to be for the sake of justice, for the defense of his faith. He would often find himself alone at night, his thoughts drifting to the battles ahead, to the lives he would protect. He prayed, his voice a quiet whisper, asking for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to fulfill the role he had been given. For Khalid, this was more than just a title. It was his calling. One evening, as he sat by the fire, he was approached by an elder from the camp, a man who had seen many battles, who had known many leaders. The elder looked at him, his eyes filled with a quiet respect. "You are young, Khalid," he said, his voice soft. "But you carry a wisdom beyond your years. Allah has chosen well. The sword of Allah suits you." Khalid nodded, his gaze steady. "It is not a title I take lightly," he replied, his voice filled with conviction. "I am here to protect, to defend, to serve, and I will do so, with every breath, every drop of strength in me." The elder placed a hand on Khalid's shoulder, a silent gesture of support, of understanding. They sat together in the quiet, two warriors bound by faith, by loyalty. From that day on, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of Allah, led his people with unwavering strength. He became known not only for his skill in battle, but for his sense of justice, his loyalty, his heart. He fought not for pride, not for glory, but for a purpose greater than himself. In every battle, in every decision, he carried the weight of his title with honor, for he knew that he was not just Khalid, he was Saifullah, the Sword of Allah. And with that knowledge, he faced each day, each challenge, with courage, with resolve, with an unbreakable spirit. For the Sword of Allah could never be broken. Chapter 7. The Battle of Mutah, a stand against thousands. The cold dawn was breaking over the plains of Mutah, and as the first light touched the horizon, Khalid ibn al-Walid stood still, his gaze fixed on the vast army before him. His heart pounded with a steady rhythm, not of fear, but of readiness. Before him stretched the Roman forces, thousands of soldiers in disciplined lines, their armor gleaming, their weapons raised in anticipation. The ground trembled beneath their numbers. Behind Khalid, his own troops waited. They were exhausted, weary from days of marching, and far fewer than the enemy. Khalid knew the odds. They were outnumbered, outmatched. But he also knew they had something the Romans didn't. A purpose, a strength that went beyond numbers. He took a deep breath, steadying his thoughts. Today, he would be tested as never before. The Muslim forces were silent, their faces tense, their eyes wide with the weight of what lay ahead. Many of them cast anxious glances at Khalid, searching for reassurance, for strength. And he did not let them down. He raised his voice, his tone steady and filled with resolve. "We stand against thousands," he called out, his words carrying across the field. "They are many, yes, but they are not invincible. Our strength lies in our unity, our faith, in our trust in Allah. The men around him felt a surge of courage. Khalid's voice was a lifeline, pulling them from the depths of fear. He was the sword of Allah, and with him leading, they knew they had a chance. No matter the odds, the command was given. With a shout, the Muslim forces surged forward, meeting the Romans with a clash of steel, a storm of shouts and cries that filled the air. Swords clanged, shields shattered, and the dust rose in thick clouds, blurring the lines between friend and foe. Khalid moved like lightning, his sword flashing as he struck down one soldier, then another. His mind was a fortress, calculating, observing, planning. Amidst the chaos, he could see his men struggling, see the lines bending under the relentless pressure of the Roman forces. He knew he had to act fast, or they would be overwhelmed. It was then that tragedy struck. The leaders of the Muslim army, brave men Khalid had fought alongside, began to fall. One by one, they were struck down, their sacrifices leaving a gap in the leadership. Fear rippled through the ranks, a sense of despair setting in as their commanders fell. Khalid, seeing the loss, felt a wave of grief, but he did not falter. He knew that the survival of his men now depended on him. He could not let fear grip him. He could not let hesitation cloud his mind. He called out, rallying his men. "With me!" he shouted, his voice fierce and unyielding. "Stand with me, brothers, for as long as we stand together, we are not defeated." The men rallied to him, their spirits lifted by his strength, his unbreakable will. Khalid knew that he could not afford a single mistake, that every decision he made would be the difference between life and death for his men. In the heat of battle, Khalid's mind raced with strategy. He knew they could not win by brute force. They were outnumbered, and the Romans' discipline was formidable. He needed a way to break their formation, to confuse them, to buy his men the chance to survive. With quick commands, he began to maneuver his troops, pulling them back in calculated steps, drawing the Roman forces into a pattern they didn't realize was forming. His movements were swift, precise. Every retreat, every advance, each one designed to create an illusion. The Romans, seeing the Muslims fall back, pressed forward with confidence, believing victory was near. But Khalid was not retreating in surrender. He was drawing them in, positioning them exactly where he wanted them. And then, with a sudden shout, he ordered a surprise flank attack, catching the Romans off guard. His men charged from the sides, breaking the Roman lines, causing chaos in their ranks. Khalid's strategy was working. The Romans, who had believed the battle was theirs, found themselves surrounded, confused, vulnerable. The tide began to shift, and Khalid seized the opportunity. He led charge after charge, his men following him with renewed courage, inspired by his fearless leadership. He was everywhere, at the front, in the middle, directing, guiding, fighting. His presence alone filled his men with strength, with hope. But even as they fought, Khalid knew they could not hold out forever. The Romans regrouped quickly, their sheer numbers pressing against the Muslims once again. He felt the exhaustion in his limbs, saw it in the faces of his men. They were giving everything, but it might not be enough. In a moment of clarity, Khalid realized what he had to do. He knew they could not win this battle by defeating the Romans. Their victory would be in survival, in the strength to fight another day. With a heavy heart, he called for a tactical retreat. His voice, strong and clear, reached every soldier. "We live to fight again, brothers. Fall back with order, with strength. This is not the end. It is only the beginning." His men obeyed, their movements disciplined, each step measured. Khalid's retreat was not a surrender. It was a strategy, a survival. Under his guidance, they moved back in organized groups, each protecting the other, each fighting off the Romans as they retreated with precision. The Romans, stunned by Khalid's skill, did not pursue. They had been drawn into a battle they hadn't expected, faced with a foe who fought with not only strength, but wisdom. Khalid had led his men out of the jaws of defeat, his strategy saving the Muslim forces from certain annihilation. When they finally reached safety, Khalid looked over his men, his heart filled with pride. They had survived. Against all odds, against an army far larger and better equipped, they had stood their ground, had fought with courage, with unity. He had lost friends, seen the pain of battle. But he knew they had gained something precious as well. They had gained a faith in themselves, a belief in their strength. Khalid turned to his men, his face weary but his eyes filled with a fierce light. "Remember this day," he told them, his voice strong. "Remember that we stood, that we fought, that we are unbreakable." The men cheered, their voices ringing out across the desert, filling the night with a sense of triumph. They had survived the impossible, faced down a force that should have destroyed them, and all because they had followed Khalid, the sword of Allah. In the quiet that followed, Khalid sat alone, his heart heavy with the memory of those they had lost, but also filled with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that there would be more battles, more tests of his strength, his strategy, his faith. But after Mutah, he understood something deeper about himself, about his role. He was not only a warrior, he was a protector, a guide. He was the sword of Allah, and his duty was not only to fight, but to lead his people to safety, to inspire them to believe in their strength. As he gazed out over the desert, the stars shining down like silent witnesses, Khalid made a vow. He would face every battle, every trial, with the same courage, the same wisdom that had saved them today. And he would do it, not for himself, but for those who fought beside him, for the path he had chosen. For the sword of Allah was forged not just in victory, but in survival, and in the unbreakable strength of a leader's heart. Chapter 8. The Conquest of Mecca, from foe to protector. The sands of Mecca whispered of memories, of battles fought, of alliances made and broken, and now, under the shadow of a new dawn, Khalid ibn al-Walid returned to the city of his birth. But this time, he was not coming as a warrior seeking revenge, not as a conqueror wielding his sword. He came as a protector, a man of peace, determined to bring justice without bloodshed. The city lay silent as the Muslim forces approached. The air was thick with tension, the people of Mecca watching with anxious eyes from behind doors, peering out from narrow streets. They had heard tales of Khalid's strength, his bravery, but also of his new faith, his loyalty to the Prophet Muhammad. And now, they wondered, what would this mean for them? Khalid rode at the front, his face calm, his gaze steady. But inside, his heart was a storm. He remembered every corner of this city, every street, every familiar face. This was the place of his childhood, his first battles, the city that had shaped him. But it was also the place he had once sworn to defend against the very people he now called his brothers. As he entered the city, memories flooded his mind. He could see himself as a young warrior, fiercely loyal to Mecca, to the traditions of his family, to the gods he had once worshipped. How strange, he thought, that life had brought him back here, not as a defender of old ways, but as a harbinger of change. The prophet had given clear orders. There was to be no bloodshed, no revenge. This was a conquest of the heart, a return to the city with peace, not vengeance. And Khalid understood the weight of these words. For years, he had fought to protect Mecca from Islam, had resisted with all his strength, only to find himself on the other side, now defending his faith, his people. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his past, but also the hope of his present. Today, he would walk these streets not as an enemy, but as a protector. As Khalid and his men moved through the streets, they encountered groups of people, some curious, others fearful, a few defiant. He felt their eyes on him, saw the fear and mistrust in their gazes. They remembered him as a fierce warrior of Quraysh, as the man who had once stood against the prophet and his followers. He stopped in the middle of the street, dismounted from his horse, and looked at the people around him. "People of Mecca," he called out, his voice steady but filled with compassion. "We come not to destroy, but to protect. Our prophet has commanded peace, and peace is what we bring." The people watched him, their expressions softening, their fear slowly giving way to a cautious hope. Khalid's voice was not the voice of a conqueror. It was the voice of a man who understood their fear, their uncertainty. He had once felt it too. As he walked deeper into the city, the memories became stronger. He passed by the place where he had trained as a young man, the open square where he had fought his first battle, the walls that had once been his fortress. He remembered the pride he had felt, the loyalty he had given to this city, to its people. But he also remembered the conflicts, the battles that had scarred Mecca, the blood that had been shed. He had once fought to protect this place, believing he was defending his family's honor, his tribe's legacy. And now he realized that his purpose had not changed, only the path. He was still here to protect, to bring justice. But this time, it was for a higher purpose, a purpose that transcended tribe and family. As he walked, people began to gather, their expressions filled with wonder. They had expected fear, anger, but Khalid's face held only calm, only the strength of a man who had found his way. Finally, he reached the Kaaba, the heart of Mecca, the place he had once worshipped idols, the place he had once defended with his life. Now it stood silent before him, an ancient symbol of his past and a new symbol of his faith. With a deep breath, he entered the sacred area, feeling the weight of years, the memories of battles, of loyalty, of struggle. He knew that this moment was not just for him, but for everyone who had fought, who had sacrificed, who had dreamed of peace. Khalid knelt, bowing his head, feeling a sense of humility he had never known. The journey that had brought him here was not a simple one. It had been filled with hardship, with loss, with transformation. But here, in the heart of Mecca, he felt complete. He had returned, not to conquer, but to heal, to bring unity, to protect. As he rose, he looked around at the people watching him, his gaze filled with compassion. He could see the questions in their eyes, the hesitation, the fear. And he spoke, his voice strong but gentle. "Mecca is our home, and I am here to protect it, to protect all of you. We do not come with swords raised, but with peace. We come to unite, not to divide." And then a sound filled the air, the call to prayer. The Muslims gathered around the Kaaba, and Khalid joined them, feeling a deep sense of belonging, a sense of purpose that filled his heart. He knew that this was his true calling, to stand with his people, to protect them, to guide them, not with force, but with faith. The people of Mecca watched in silence as Khalid prayed. Some were moved, others still hesitant, but they could all see the sincerity in his actions, the peace that radiated from him. He was not the man they had once feared, not the warrior who had fought against them. He was a man of faith, a protector, a leader. After the prayer, Khalid walked through the city once more, his heart filled with gratitude, his soul at peace. He knew that there would be challenges ahead, that not everyone would accept this change, but he also knew that he was ready, that he was prepared to face whatever lay ahead with patience, with strength, with compassion. For Khalid, the conquest of Mecca was not a victory of arms, but a victory of the heart. He had returned to his birthplace, not as a conqueror, but as a protector, as the sword of Allah. And with that title came a promise to bring justice, to guard the people of Mecca, to ensure that peace would reign. As he walked, he felt the eyes of his people upon him, saw the hope beginning to blossom in their hearts. They saw in him not just a leader, but a protector, a man who had once been their enemy, but now stood as their guardian. And so, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, returned to Mecca, his heart at peace, his purpose clear. He was no longer a man of vengeance, no longer a warrior for pride. He was a man of faith, a man who would lead with strength, with justice, with humility. And with each step he took, he left behind the shadows of his past and embraced the light of his future. Chapter 9. Yarmouk. The Unbreakable Commander. The field of Yarmouk stretched before them, a vast, dusty plain under a sky thick with tension. Khalid ibn al-Walid stood at the front of his army, his gaze steady as he took in the sight of the Byzantine forces on the opposite side. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, their armor gleaming in the sun, their ranks stretching far into the distance. The Byzantines had come prepared, their numbers enough to crush any army that dared to oppose them. But Khalid was not any commander, and his army was not any force. He knew they were outnumbered, outmatched in armor, supplies, and men. But numbers did not decide a battle. Heart did. Purpose. And the unwavering belief that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. He turned to his soldiers, each one watching him with a mix of fear and fierce loyalty. Khalid raised his voice, a calm yet powerful tone that carried across the field. Today, we face a mighty enemy. Today, we are tested. But remember, he paused, letting his gaze sweep over them. We do not stand alone. We fight with the strength of our faith, the courage of our brothers, and the trust of Allah. The men let out a roar, their spirits ignited, their fear replaced with a fire that only Khalid could inspire. He saw their faces, filled with determination, their hands gripping their swords, ready to face whatever came. Today, they would fight. And they would fight like lions. The Byzantine forces began their advance, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The sight was overwhelming. Endless ranks of soldiers marching forward, a wall of steel and strength. But Khalid's eyes remained calm, his mind sharp, every part of him focused on what lay ahead. "Hold your ground," he commanded, his voice a rock amidst the storm. He watched as his men held the line, their faces set, their hearts steady. The Byzantines approached, closer and closer, until, with a single cry, the clash began. The field exploded into chaos. Swords clashed, shields shattered, and dust rose like a cloud, swallowing the battlefield in a storm of noise and fury. Khalid was in the thick of it, his sword flashing, his movements precise, his mind calculating each move, each strike. He was not only fighting, he was guiding, directing his men, holding the line with an unbreakable will. But the weight of the Byzantine forces was relentless. Wave after wave, they crashed against the Muslim lines, pushing, pressing, forcing them back inch by inch. Khalid felt the strain, saw the exhaustion in his men's eyes. They were holding, but only just. And then, Khalid made his move. With a swift command, he ordered a group to break from the main line, flanking the Byzantine forces from the side. It was a risky maneuver, one that left them exposed. But Khalid saw what others could not. He saw the weakness in the Byzantine line, a small gap in their formation that could be exploited. He led the charge himself, his heart pounding with the thrill of the moment. His men followed, their cries filling the air as they attacked from the side, catching the Byzantines off guard. The enemy lines wavered, a ripple of confusion spreading through their ranks. Khalid struck with precision, each blow calculated, each move intentional. He was not just fighting, he was commanding the very flow of the battle. But the Byzantines regrouped quickly, their numbers overwhelming, and soon the Muslim forces found themselves surrounded, encircled by the sheer mass of the enemy. Khalid's heart pounded, but his gaze remained steady. This was not a time for fear. He raised his voice, calling out to his men, "Stand firm! We are not defeated until we give in, and we will never give in." His words were like a lifeline, pulling his men from the depths of exhaustion, giving them strength, courage, resolve. For hours, the battle raged, a brutal, unyielding struggle of will and endurance. The sun climbed high, casting a harsh light over the field, turning the dust into a blinding haze. Khalid could feel the weight of each decision, each move, each order. He saw his men fighting with everything they had, pushing back the Byzantine forces with sheer determination. Yet, as the day wore on, the exhaustion began to take its toll. Khalid knew they could not hold forever, that each moment was a race against time. His mind worked like lightning, searching for any advantage, any opening that could turn the tide. And then he saw it. The Byzantine commander had overextended his forces, stretching them too thin in an attempt to break the Muslim lines. Khalid seized the moment, ordering a sudden retreat, drawing the Byzantines forward into a trap. His men, disciplined and swift, fell back with precision, leading the Byzantine soldiers into a vulnerable position. At the right moment, Khalid gave the command. His forces turned, striking with a ferocity that caught the Byzantines off guard. The enemy line shattered, their formation collapsing as confusion spread through their ranks. Khalid's men fought with renewed strength, their voices rising in a fierce battle cry as they drove the Byzantines back. Khalid himself was at the front, his sword a blur, his presence a force that filled his men with courage. He was tireless, unstoppable, a leader who led by example, by action, by heart. As the day turned to dusk, the Byzantine forces began to falter, their strength waning, their morale broken. Khalid's relentless tactics, his unbreakable will, had worn them down, drained their resolve. Finally, after hours of brutal combat, The Byzantines began to retreat, their ranks scattering, their spirits crushed. Khalid watched them fall back, his heart filled with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. They had done it. Against all odds, against an army that should have overwhelmed them, they had stood firm. They had held their ground. His men gathered around him, their faces weary but filled with triumph. Khalid looked at each of them, his gaze filled with gratitude, respect. These men, they had fought with everything they had followed him into the heart of battle, had trusted him with their lives. Today, he said, his voice quiet but powerful, we have shown the world what faith, what courage, what unity can achieve. You are warriors of heart, of strength, and today you have made history. A cheer rose from his men, their voices ringing out across the battlefield, a sound of victory, of survival, of unbreakable spirit. They had faced the might of the Byzantine Empire, and they had prevailed. As night fell, Khalid sat alone, the silence a sharp contrast to the chaos of the day. He felt the weight of his exhaustion, the toll of the battle settling in his bones. But more than that, he felt a sense of purpose, of fulfillment. He had led his men through one of the hardest battles of his life, had faced the limits of his strength, his will, and had not broken. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, had proven once again that he was more than a warrior. He was a leader, a protector, a man whose spirit could not be defeated. And as he looked out over the quiet battlefield, he knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more battles, more tests, but he would face them all. For he was the sword of Allah, and his heart was as unbreakable as his faith. For the fires of Yarmouk had forged him anew, unbreakable, unstoppable, forever the sword of Allah. Chapter 10. The Heart of a Warrior, the Mind of a Leader. The stories of Khalid ibn al-Walid's victories filled the lands, tales of fierce battles and flawless strategies echoing through cities and villages. He was known as the Sword of Allah, a title that commanded respect, fear, and awe. But beyond the victories, beyond the battlefield, there was another side to Khalid, a side that only his soldiers, those who followed him closely, truly understood. Khalid was more than a warrior. He was a leader, one with a heart that valued justice, mercy, and humility, even when glory shone upon him. One night, after a long day of marching, Khalid sat with his soldiers around a small fire. The men were exhausted, their faces weary, their bodies aching from days of endless travel. But Khalid, he sat among them, listening to their stories, sharing their laughter, their worries. He was not distant, not removed from their struggles. In these moments, he was not their commander. He was one of them. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, spoke of his family, his voice filled with sadness. Khalid listened closely, his eyes reflecting understanding. And when the boy finished, Khalid placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Fear not," he said softly, his voice filled with warmth. "For they are proud of you, as I am. You are not alone in this journey. We stand together, as brothers." The young soldier's eyes shone with gratitude, his fear fading. In that moment, he saw not just a commander, but a protector, a leader who cared for each of his men as if they were his own family. Khalid's compassion extended beyond his words. It was in his actions, in the way he led by example. During one difficult campaign, as his army traveled through harsh desert lands, they ran low on supplies. water was scarce, and the soldiers grew weak, their steps heavy, their spirits strained. But Khalid, he refused to drink until every last soldier had their fill. His lips were dry, his face weathered by the relentless sun, yet he held fast to his decision. His men tried to insist, tried to urge him to drink, but he simply shook his head, his gaze unyielding. "If my men thirst," he said firmly, "then so do I." His words spread through the ranks, filling his soldiers with a sense of pride, a loyalty that could not be broken. They knew then, without a doubt, that their leader would not abandon them, that he would face every hardship they faced, shoulder to shoulder. Khalid's sense of justice was as fierce as his loyalty. He was a man who believed in fairness, who valued each soldier not for his rank or background, but for his heart, his courage, his dedication. One day, a dispute arose between two soldiers, a clash of pride that threatened to disrupt the unity of the group. Khalid called them both forward, his expression calm, his eyes steady. "What is honor?" he asked them, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "If it brings discord among brothers." The soldiers, humbled, looked at their leader with a newfound respect. Khalid had no need for punishment or harsh words. His presence alone was enough to restore peace, to remind his men of their duty, not just to him, but to each other. But perhaps the greatest measure of Khalid's heart was seen in his humility. After every victory, after every battle won, he would stand among his men, his face calm, his expression free of pride. He would look at them, the soldiers who had fought with him, who had followed his every command, and he would speak with a quiet, honest gratitude. "Victory is not mine alone," he would say, his voice steady. "It belongs to each of you. We are only as strong as the hearts that stand beside us." His men, inspired, felt a sense of pride that went beyond the battlefield. They felt valued, respected, seen. To them, Khalid was not just a leader. He was a man who understood their struggles, their sacrifices, a man who saw them as equals. One day, as they prepared for battle, Khalid noticed an older soldier struggling with his armor, his hands shaking, his face lined with worry. The man, once strong and swift, had begun to feel the weight of his years, the toll of countless battles. Khalid approached him, a soft smile on his face. Without a word, he knelt beside him, helping him adjust his armor, his movements gentle, respectful. The soldier looked at him in surprise, his eyes filled with emotion. "Commander," he stammered, You don't need to do this." But Khalid only shook his head, his smile unwavering. "Today, I serve you, as you have served me." The soldier, humbled, nodded, his heart filled with a loyalty that words could not express. Khalid's actions spoke louder than any command, any title. He was a man who led by lifting others, by honoring their service, their courage. Even in the face of victory, Khalid remained humble, aware of the fleeting nature of glory. After one particularly fierce battle, his men celebrated, their voices filled with triumph. But Khalid, he stood quietly, his gaze distant, as if seeing something far beyond the field of victory. A soldier approached him, his face filled with admiration. "You have led us to victory once more, Commander. The glory is yours." But Khalid looked at him, a sadness in his eyes, a wisdom that went beyond the moment. "Glory is but dust in the wind," he replied softly. "It fades, it passes. What remains is honor, is duty, is faith. The soldier nodded, understanding the depth of his leader's words. Khalid had never sought glory for himself. He fought not for fame, but for justice, for his faith, for the men who looked to him with trust. And so, the legend of Khalid ibn al-Walid grew, not just as a warrior, but as a man of compassion, of humility, of wisdom. His soldiers would tell stories of his kindness, his sense of justice, his unwavering commitment to their well-being. They would speak of the man who shared their burdens, who understood their fears, who stood beside them in every hardship. For Khalid, leadership was not about power, nor about commanding obedience. It was about serving, about giving of himself, about lifting those who followed him. He valued mercy, even in the heat of battle, believed in justice, even in the harshest moments. His heart was as strong as his sword, his mind as sharp as his strategy. In the quiet of the night, when the camp lay still, Khalid would sit alone, his thoughts drifting to the battles ahead, to the lives he had touched. He was the sword of Allah, yes, but he was more than that. He was a protector, a guide, a leader whose strength lay not in his might, but in his heart. And so, Khalid ibn al-Walid continued his journey, a warrior with the soul of a leader, a man whose compassion, wisdom, and humility would leave a legacy far greater than any battle he fought. For in every decision, in every act of kindness, he showed the true strength of a warrior's heart and the wisdom of a leader's mind. Chapter 11. The Final Days. Reflections of a Warrior. The room was quiet, shadows stretching across the walls as the light of day slowly faded. Khalid ibn al-Walid lay on his bed, his breathing shallow, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. He could